In a barren valley where two armies stood facing each other, the figure of Goliath emerged as the ultimate symbol of overwhelming dominance. His power was not merely physical, though his massive stature, heavy armor, and imposing presence were undeniable, but psychological. He did not need to charge into battle or swing a weapon to establish control over the battlefield. His very presence was enough. Each day, he stepped forward and issued the same challenge, his voice echoing across the valley with deliberate consistency. There was no variation, no urgency, only repetition. And it was precisely this repetition that transformed fear from a momentary reaction into a deeply embedded mental state. The soldiers were not just afraid when they saw him, they began to expect fear before he even appeared. On the opposing side, the army of Israel was far from weak. They were equipped with weapons, trained in warfare, and organized under leadership. By any conventional military assessment, they possessed the necessary resources to engage in battle. Yet what unfolded contradicted all expectations. Not a single soldier stepped forward, not one accepted the challenge. Day after day, they remained in position, watching Goliath appear and withdraw, but never advancing themselves. This was not a failure of capability, it was a collapse of psychological readiness. Fear did not remain confined to individuals, it spread across the entire group, becoming a shared condition. When no one acted, that collective inaction became a form of silent validation. It suggested, without words, that action itself was impossible. Thus, a paradox emerged, an army with strength that could not access or utilize that strength. From this, a critical conclusion can be drawn. They had already lost before the battle even began. Their defeat was not the result of combat, strategic error, or physical inferiority. It originated in a belief, a deeply internalized conviction, that victory was unattainable. Once such a belief takes hold within a group, it becomes more powerful than any external force. It defines behavior, limits perception, and ultimately dictates outcomes. To understand this more precisely, we must examine the nature of the fear that dominated the battlefield. This fear did not arise solely from objective reality. Yes, Goliath was larger, stronger, and more intimidating than any individual opponent. But those facts alone do not logically necessitate the conclusion that he could not be defeated. The decisive factor lies in interpretation. Human cognition is wired to prioritize survival, and when confronted with an overwhelming threat, the brain often defaults to a protective shortcut. This cannot be won. This conclusion is not rigorously analyzed or tested. It is accepted because it reduces immediate psychological tension. In essence, it is a defensive mechanism disguised as rational judgment. Once this conclusion is formed, every subsequent observation reinforces it. Each time Goliath steps forward and no one responds, the belief gains credibility. This is where the crowd effect, also known as social proof, begins to operate. When individuals are uncertain, they look to others to determine appropriate behavior. If everyone remains still, then remaining still appears to be the correct decision. No explicit command is necessary. The behavior of the group becomes the message. Over time, that message solidifies into an unspoken norm. In this context, silence becomes a form of false evidence. It does not prove that Goliath is unbeatable, but it convinces everyone that he is. This is a systemic cognitive distortion. People confuse "no one has tried" with "it cannot be done." As this distortion spreads, it creates a closed psychological loop. The mechanism is simple but highly destructive. Perception leads to fear. Fear leads to inaction. Inaction reinforces fear. Each stage strengthens the next, making escape increasingly difficult. What makes this loop particularly dangerous is that it becomes self-sustaining. It no longer depends on the continuous presence of the external threat. Even in the absence of Goliath, the fear persists because it has been internalized. The soldiers are no longer reacting to reality, they are reacting to their belief about reality. And once a belief of limitation is internalized, individuals begin to constrain their own behavior without any external enforcement. At this point, the core issue on the battlefield is no longer the disparity in physical strength between two sides. It is the interpretation of that disparity. Goliath may indeed be powerful, but what renders him invincible exists primarily in the minds of his opponents. When a flawed belief is collectively reinforced, it becomes more restrictive than any physical barrier. It shapes perception, dictates behavior, and ultimately determines outcomes. This is where the narrative reaches a critical threshold. The conditions for change do not lie in altering the external reality. Goliath remains the same, but in transforming the internal framework through which that reality is perceived. Until that shift occurs, the outcome remains fixed. Once it does, however, even the most dominant force can be re-evaluated, redefined, and ultimately challenged. It is precisely at this point, when fear has stabilized into a collective certainty, that the narrative introduces a disruptive variable: David. His arrival does not follow the expected pattern of escalation. He is not a decorated warrior, not a seasoned combatant, and not someone shaped by the psychological atmosphere of the battlefield. Instead, he enters from an entirely different domain of experience. His background is pastoral, not military. He is a shepherd, accustomed to open fields, long hours of solitude, and the quiet responsibility of protecting a flock against unpredictable threats. He carries no armor, no sword, no visible markers of strength that would typically qualify someone for a confrontation of this magnitude. From a conventional standpoint, David is fundamentally unprepared. He lacks formal training in warfare, has no experience in organized combat, and does not possess the equipment deemed necessary for survival in a direct engagement. Yet these apparent deficiencies conceal a structural advantage that is not immediately visible. Unlike the soldiers who have been standing in the valley for days, absorbing, reinforcing, and internalizing fear, David has not been conditioned by repetition. He has not witnessed the daily ritual of intimidation. He has not participated in the silent consensus that defines Goliath as unbeatable. In other words, he exists outside the psychological system that has immobilized everyone else. This distinction is critical. David's difference is not primarily physical, it is perceptual. Where others have undergone a process of gradual psychological erosion, he arrives without that burden. He does not share the same interpretive framework, and therefore he does not arrive at the same conclusion. When he looks at Goliath, he does not see an abstract symbol of invincibility. He does not perceive an insurmountable force or an inevitable defeat. Instead, he sees something far more concrete and far less intimidating: a target. This shift may appear subtle, but it fundamentally alters the structure of the situation. A giant implies scale, dominance, and impossibility. A target, by contrast, implies specificity, vulnerability, and actionability. The object itself has not changed. Goliath remains as large, as armed, and as imposing as before, but the cognitive framing applied to him is entirely different. And that difference reshapes everything that follows. To understand the magnitude of this shift, it is useful to contrast David's perception with that of the Israelite soldiers. For them, the situation has already been resolved in advance. They see a confrontation that cannot be won, and therefore they do not engage. Their attention is dominated by the perceived disparity in strength. Every observable feature of Goliath, his height, his armor, his voice, feeds into a single narrative. Defeat is certain. This narrative does not merely influence their emotions, it dictates their behavior. They hesitate, they delay, and ultimately, they remain inactive. David operates under a completely different cognitive model. He does not deny the reality of Goliath's size or strength, but he does not assign to those attributes the same deterministic meaning. Instead of asking, "How can someone like me defeat someone like him?" he implicitly reframes the question: what exactly is in front of me, and how can it be addressed? This reframing transforms a paralyzing abstraction into a solvable problem. The divergence becomes even clearer when examining behavioral outcomes. The Israelite soldiers, confronted with uncertainty and risk, default to observation and waiting. They look to one another for cues, hoping that someone else will initiate action. This is a classic diffusion of responsibility. When everyone is equally capable of acting, no one feels individually compelled to do so. The result is collective inertia. David, by contrast, does not engage in this process of social referencing. He does not wait for consensus, nor does he seek validation from the group. His decision-making is internally anchored. Once he determines that action is necessary, he moves toward it directly. This is not recklessness, it is clarity. He is not driven by the absence of fear, but by the absence of distortion. He sees the situation without the accumulated bias that has paralyzed others. Another key difference lies in emotional regulation. The soldiers interpret Goliath's presence as overwhelming, triggering a stress response that narrows perception and limits strategic thinking. David remains comparatively composed. This composure is not accidental. It is a function of his prior experiences. As a shepherd, he has already faced threats that required immediate, decisive action without external support. In those moments, hesitation would have resulted in loss. Over time, this has conditioned him to respond to danger not with avoidance, but with engagement. What emerges from this comparison is a fundamental insight. Reality, in itself, is not the sole determinant of outcome. The interpretation of reality plays an equally, if not more, significant role. The physical conditions on the battlefield are identical for both David and the Israelite army. The same opponent stands before them under the same environmental constraints. Yet the results diverge dramatically, not because the situation changes, but because the perspective applied to it differs. This leads to a broader principle with implications far beyond the immediate narrative. When individuals define a situation as unwinnable, they unconsciously align their behavior with that definition. They withdraw, delay, or avoid engagement altogether. Conversely, when a situation is framed as a challenge or a target, it activates a different set of cognitive and behavioral processes: problem-solving, focus, and execution. In this sense, David's greatest advantage is not physical capability, but interpretive independence. He is not constrained by the shared assumptions of the group. He does not inherit their conclusions, and therefore he is free to generate his own. This independence allows him to perceive possibilities that others cannot see, not because those possibilities were absent, but because they were obscured by collective belief. The implication is both simple and profound. The external world may remain constant, but outcomes can vary dramatically based on how that world is perceived. A shift in perspective does not alter the size of the obstacle, but it can redefine what the obstacle represents. And once that redefinition occurs, new forms of action become available. Thus, the contrast between the Israelite soldiers and David is not merely a contrast of courage or skill, it is a contrast of perception. One group sees inevitability, the other sees opportunity. One waits for change, the other initiates it. And in that difference lies the turning point of the entire narrative. Reality does not change, but the way it is seen determines what becomes possible. As the contrast in perception becomes clear, the narrative advances into a more critical layer: strategy. Perception alone is not sufficient to produce victory. It must translate into a concrete method of engagement. This is where the majority fails decisively. The Israelite soldiers, even in their hesitation, have already accepted a fundamental premise without questioning it: the rules of the confrontation. Implicitly, they assume that if a battle is to occur, it must take the form that Goliath dictates: close-range combat, strength against strength, weapon against weapon. Within that framework, the outcome is predictable. Goliath is optimized for precisely that kind of encounter. His size, armor, and weaponry are not merely advantages. They are overwhelming advantages in a direct clash. This is the first and most consequential error of the majority. They do not just fear the opponent, they accept his terms. By doing so, they enter a game in which they are structurally disadvantaged from the outset. Even if one of them were to step forward, the probability of success would remain extremely low, not because victory is inherently impossible, but because the mode of engagement has already been defined in favor of the opponent. This is a classic strategic failure, confusing courage with effectiveness. Stepping forward under the wrong conditions does not create heroism, it reinforces defeat. David, however, does not inherit this assumption. His earlier perceptual independence now extends into strategic independence. When offered armor and conventional weapons, tools that would symbolically and practically align him with the expected mode of combat, he refuses them. This decision is often interpreted as humility or simplicity, but in analytical terms, it is a rejection of imposed constraints. He understands, intuitively or experientially, that adopting those tools would force him into the same framework that has already immobilized everyone else. To wear the armor is not merely to protect himself. It is to agree to fight the wrong battle. Instead, David selects instruments that are consistent with his own experience and strengths: a sling and stones. These are not random choices. As a shepherd, he has used them repeatedly in real situations, defending his flock against predators that required speed, precision, and distance rather than brute force. What he brings to the battlefield is not inferior equipment, but a different system of engagement altogether. By maintaining distance, he neutralizes the primary advantage of his opponent. By relying on accuracy rather than power, he shifts the determining variable of the encounter. This is the essence of asymmetric strategy. Rather than attempting to match the opponent's strengths, David avoids them entirely. He does not seek to become stronger than Goliath. He ensures that strength is no longer the decisive factor. In doing so, he redefines the structure of the conflict. What was originally a test of physical dominance becomes a test of precision, timing, and positioning. And within this redefined framework, the balance of power shifts. The critical insight here is often overlooked. Victory does not require superiority in absolute terms. It requires superiority within the chosen domain of engagement. By refusing to play according to the opponent's rules, David creates a new set of conditions in which those rules no longer apply. This is not an act of defiance for its own sake. It is a calculated reconfiguration of the problem space. The moment this shift occurs, the inevitability of defeat disappears, not because the opponent has changed, but because the logic governing the interaction has changed. This strategic reframing leads directly into the climax, the moment where abstraction becomes action. Up to this point, everything has been preparation. The collapse of collective confidence, the emergence of a new perspective, and the establishment of an alternative strategy. But none of these elements matter without execution. And execution, by its nature, requires a decisive break from hesitation. David steps forward. This movement, simple as it appears, carries immense significance. It occurs in direct contrast to the behavior of the entire army behind him. While they remain fixed in place, constrained by fear and uncertainty, he advances toward the very threat they have been avoiding. This is not merely a physical action, it is the manifestation of a different internal state. Where others see risk as a signal to withdraw, he interprets it as a condition to engage. What follows is remarkably brief. There is no prolonged exchange, no extended demonstration of skill in the conventional sense. David takes a single stone, places it in his sling, and releases it with precision. The motion is efficient, controlled, and unhesitating. The stone travels its trajectory and strikes its target. In that instant, the entire structure of dominance collapses. Goliath falls, not gradually, not after a drawn-out struggle, but immediately. The brevity of this moment is essential to its meaning. The outcome is not determined by endurance or accumulation of effort, but by the accuracy of a single action executed at the right time. This leads to a crucial clarification. The victory does not originate from the stone itself. The stone is merely the final instrument in a chain of prior decisions. The true turning point occurred earlier, when David chose to step forward, to reject the imposed framework, and to act according to a different understanding. In this sense, the decisive factor is not the tool, but the decision. Without that decision, the stone would never have been released. Without that decision, the battle would never have occurred. The physical event is the visible endpoint of an invisible process, a shift in perception leading to a shift in strategy, culminating in a commitment to act. From here, the narrative extends beyond the battlefield into a broader application. The figure of Goliath does not remain confined to a historical or symbolic past. It evolves into a recurring pattern within human experience. In modern contexts, Goliath rarely appears as a literal opponent. Instead, it manifests in more abstract but equally powerful forms: persistent fear, social pressure, comparison with others, and the weight of past failures. These forces, while less visible, operate in similar ways. They shape perception, influence belief, and constrain action. The behavioral consequences are also consistent. Individuals delay decisions, postpone initiatives, and hesitate to begin. They engage in self-doubt, questioning their own capacity before any external test occurs. Opportunities are recognized but not pursued. Ideas are formed but not executed. In each case, the underlying mechanism is the same as on the battlefield. A conclusion is reached in advance. This will not work. I am not capable. The risk is too great. And behavior aligns accordingly. The most dangerous aspect of this process is not the presence of difficulty, but the internalization of limitation. When a person begins to believe that they have no real chance, action ceases entirely. Unlike external obstacles, which can be analyzed and addressed, this internal barrier operates silently. It does not need reinforcement from the outside. It sustains itself through repetition and memory. Past failures become evidence, comparisons become judgments, and hesitation becomes habit. At this stage, the individual effectively replicates the condition of the Israelite army. The battle is never fought, not because it cannot be won, but because it is never engaged. The absence of action is then interpreted as confirmation of the original belief, completing the cycle. This is why the central lesson extends beyond courage or even strategy. It concerns the point at which a person decides whether to accept or reject the perceived boundaries of their situation. Goliath, in any form, derives its power not only from its inherent characteristics, but from the meaning assigned to it. When that meaning becomes fixed, when it is defined as unbeatable, it achieves its greatest effect without needing to act at all. Breaking this pattern does not necessarily require a dramatic transformation of external conditions. It begins with a shift similar to the one introduced earlier, redefining the problem, refusing inherited assumptions, and identifying a mode of engagement that does not reinforce disadvantage. But even that is insufficient without the final step, the willingness to act despite uncertainty. Because ultimately, the difference between a standing army and a single advancing figure is not strength, but decision. And it is at that exact point, where hesitation ends and action begins, that outcomes start to change. As the narrative expands beyond the battlefield and into the structure of human experience, it reveals a deeper psychological message, one that operates beneath strategy, beneath action, and even beneath visible outcomes. At its core, the story is not simply about how a weaker individual defeats a stronger opponent. It is about how individuals are often defeated long before any real confrontation occurs. And the source of that defeat is rarely external. You are not defeated primarily by circumstances. Circumstances, by their nature, are variable, complex, and often beyond immediate control. What determines the outcome is not the existence of difficulty, but the internal response to it. More precisely, defeat is constructed through three interconnected elements: belief, perception, and memory. These form a cognitive framework through which reality is interpreted, and once that framework stabilizes, it begins to dictate behavior. Belief is the starting point. When an individual accepts the idea that success is unlikely or impossible, that belief becomes a filter. Every piece of information is processed through it. Challenges appear larger, risks appear greater, and opportunities become less visible. Perception follows belief. Two individuals can face identical conditions, yet perceive them in entirely different ways. One sees a barrier, the other sees a problem to be solved. This divergence is not rooted in intelligence or ability, but in interpretation. Finally, memory reinforces the system. Past failures, rejections, or mistakes are stored and replayed, not as isolated events, but as evidence supporting the belief of limitation. Over time, this creates a closed loop. Belief shapes perception. Perception selects which memories are emphasized, and those memories, in turn, strengthen the original belief. Within this loop, a person can become effectively immobilized without any external constraint. They hesitate, withdraw, or choose not to act, not because they are incapable, but because they have concluded, often unconsciously, that action is futile. This is the psychological equivalent of standing on the battlefield and never stepping forward. The Goliath in this case is not a physical opponent, but an internalized certainty of defeat. Breaking this loop requires more than awareness. It requires interruption. And that interruption occurs at a specific point, the moment of decision. This leads directly into the second layer of the message, the call to action. Contrary to common expectation, there is no ideal moment to act. There is no point at which conditions become perfectly aligned, risks disappear, and certainty is guaranteed. The concept of a perfect time is itself a cognitive construct, often used to justify delay. Similarly, the idea of being fully ready is rarely realized in practice. Preparation is always incomplete, information is always partial, and outcomes are never fully predictable. This means that the decisive moment is not defined by external readiness, but by internal commitment. At some point, an individual must choose whether to remain within the boundaries of safety or to move beyond them. This is not a binary of courage versus fear. Fear is almost always present. The distinction lies in whether fear is treated as a stopping signal or as a condition that can coexist with action. There are, in essence, two paths. The first is to remain within the comfort zone, a space defined by predictability and minimal risk. Within this space, failure is limited, but so is growth. Opportunities that require exposure, uncertainty, or effort are avoided. Over time, this leads to stagnation, not because of external limitation, but because of self-imposed constraint. The second path is to step forward despite the presence of fear. This does not eliminate risk or guarantee success. What it does is create the possibility of change. Action, even imperfect action, disrupts the cycle of hesitation and begins to generate new information, new experiences that can challenge existing beliefs. This is the point at which the narrative returns to its central pattern. The difference between those who remain stationary and the one who advances is not the absence of fear, but the presence of a decision. And that decision is rarely comfortable. It often occurs in conditions of uncertainty, doubt, and incomplete knowledge. Yet it is precisely under these conditions that it becomes meaningful. Because without that step, the outcome is already fixed. The final layer of the message introduces a dimension that extends beyond psychology and strategy into the realm of faith. The story suggests that selection is not based on conventional measures of strength. David is not chosen because he is the most powerful, the most experienced, or the most prepared in a traditional sense. Instead, The defining criteria are trust and willingness. This introduces a different model of capability, one that is not limited to observable attributes. In this framework, faith does not function as a mechanism that removes obstacles. It does not eliminate uncertainty, reduce difficulty, or guarantee favorable conditions. Rather, it operates as a source of alignment and resilience. It enables an individual to act even when outcomes are unclear, to persist when results are delayed, and to maintain direction in the absence of immediate validation. Faith, in this sense, is not passive belief, it is active orientation. It connects intention with action. This perspective reframes the role of limitation. Weakness, in itself, is not disqualifying. In fact, it can become the context in which a different kind of strength emerges. When individuals recognize that they do not need to be the strongest to act, they are freed from a condition that often prevents action altogether. The requirement shifts from become sufficient to be willing. And willingness, unlike strength, is immediately accessible. What follows from this is a redefinition of power. Power is no longer measured solely by physical capacity, resources, or external validation. It is measured by the ability to act in alignment with a chosen direction, despite internal resistance and external uncertainty. In this sense, faith does not change the nature of the challenge, it changes the relationship to it. The obstacle remains, but the individual is no longer defined by it. Taken together, these layers form a coherent structure. Psychological limitation explains why individuals do not act. Strategic insight explains how they can act differently. Decision explains when action begins, and faith explains how action is sustained. Each layer builds upon the previous one, creating a pathway from paralysis to movement. At this point, the narrative is no longer about a distant event or a symbolic confrontation. It becomes a framework for interpreting present experience. Every individual, at different moments, stands in a position analogous to that valley, facing something that appears larger, stronger, or more established. The question is not whether such challenges exist. They are inevitable. The question is how they are perceived, how they are approached, and whether action is taken at all. If there is a single unifying conclusion, it is this: outcomes begin to change at the exact moment a decision is made to engage rather than withdraw. Not when conditions improve, not when fear disappears, but when action is chosen despite both. That moment may appear small, even insignificant from the outside. But structurally, it is the point at which an entire trajectory shifts. If you find this framework useful, if it helps you see your own Goliath more clearly or reconsider the way you approach it, then continue exploring these ideas further. Follow the channel, stay connected, and engage with the content ahead. Because sometimes, a single shift in perspective is all it takes to transform not just how you think, but what you are willing to do next.